Hare Krishna. This year, 2021, marks 50 years since His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, founder Acharya of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, set foot upon and thus purified the land of Malaya, the country now called Malaysia. It's an ancient country. We know from the Bhagavatam, the word Malaya is that Chandanasyeva, Malayaseva Chandanam, from Kunti Rani's prayers. Krishna appears in this world just naturally, just like that, just like chandan trees. Sandalwood trees, they grow in Malaya. So it's an ancient. Srila Prabhupada commented on this. Now they're growing rubber. Sandalwood is not seen there. And rubber isn't seen there much either nowadays, it seems. Anyway, 50 years being celebrated. And I was asked to speak about my memories of being there. And it will be chopped up into little bits and pieces for some presentation, which will be arranged by devotees in Malaysia. I first went, Malaya. Yeah, now the country is Malaysia, which includes Malaya, which is the peninsula of Malaya, which is West Malaysia, and there's also East Malaysia, which is out to the east. Most parts of Borneo and Sarawak. And I first went to Malaysia sometime in the early 1980s. I can't remember which year. Shortly after His Divine Grace Jayapataka Swami Acharya Pad was made the GBC. That was the zonal Acharya era, and the zonal Acharyas had titles such as Acharya Pad. We were into it. We didn't question it. No, it just seemed to be that's the way it is. That there are the zonal acharyas. Everyone pretty much seemed to go along with it. Of course, I was out in the backwaters of ISKCON. I was serving under Prabhavishnu Swami, who was regional secretary for Nepal, Bihar, parts of Bihar, maybe Bihar, East UP, parts of East UP, Uttar Pradesh, Bangladesh, Burma, Thailand, and now Malaysia. So it's quite a big zone. And he was under Jayapataka Maharaj as the GBC and Guru. And these were pioneering days for ISKCON in all these places. It wasn't established. It somewhat established in Nepal, and it is still just getting going. I guess you can say even today it's pioneering stage, but not like it was then. We were just going into pretty much virgin territory as far as Krishna consciousness was concerned. The zonal Acharya system was beginning to show cracks. Malaysia's GBC and Guru had been Hansadutta Swami, who had unfortunately not lived up to what was expected in such a role. He had developed something there. He had some followers. I just remember a few of the names. Nitya Krishna was a brahmachari who was with us, but mostly there was somewhat aloof from us because we were under a different guru and a different GBC, and Hansadutta, I believe, maybe had been expelled at that point from ISKCON, I'm not sure. So they weren't very pleased with us, but they weren't very much against us either. I just remember a few more of them. There was Sachi Mata and her sons, Ram Tulsi, Bhima from Singapore, Chinese devotees. Most of the devotees we made there, who came to us, sent by Krishna. They were from Indian background. The Indians in Malaysia are mostly Tamils. There are, with some areas, there are Telugu people also, and scattered here and there are Malayalis and a few Hindi speakers, North Indians, also Sindhis, Gujaratis, Sikhs and other Punjabis, but North Indians, not very many. Predominantly Tamil people there. Bhima, I believe he was from Singapore, Chinese background, and very much into Hansadutta, very active, very dynamic, but didn't like us because we were representatives of the party that had usurped their guru and their goal and their zone. Another one was Krishna Chaitanya, I believe his name was. And Krishna Chaitanya, he was from Malaysia, Malayali. No, he's from Singapore. But Singaporean citizens could live in Malaysia, no problem. And he later took initiation from Kirtanananda. He was living with us as a brahmachari. He wasn't against us. Very nice, very intellectual, eccentric, and I counted him as a friend, and still as a friend, although I don't see him much nowadays. Later he took initiation from Srila Bhakti Vaibhav Puri Maharaj, and he's living in Malaysia still. Someone else who was with Hansadutta was Krishna Balaram, who was one of Srila Prabhupada's disciples, who actually from Brahmin family of Vrindavan, and Hansadutta had given him sannyas, and he came once and he spoke in our temple there. Somewhat strange. He had his contacts all over the country. Parikshit was one of them. Or maybe Parikshit was I'm not sure. Parikshit was there, and then he went back to Kerala, where he was from. Oh, there's so many things. So Krishna, I remember he gave a strange talk on saying something like Ravana's 10 heads, they were all donkey heads. I don't know, maybe he meant to say that he was a fool, but it seemed to me he was saying it literally. Anyway, and just the things coming to my mind. Someone else who had been with Hansadutta was one of the, as far as I know, only, I believe there were 3 Malaysian disciples of Srila Prabhupada. One was Brajendra Kumar, who had joined in London, and who was my first ever traveling Sankirtan leader in England. He had been with Hansadutta and taken sannyas with him as Bhakti Brajendra Nandan Swami. And there was Ram Sharan, who was another Malayali from Malaysia, who'd also joined in England along with his good wife Janaki, and I believe they'd been there during the Hansadutta days, and they were doing preaching there. I'm not. And then there was another one who was Chinese. What was his name? Lalita Nanda or something. Lalit Kumar something. I never met him or heard anything about him. But Bhakti Brajendanandan Swami joined up with us. Exactly all the history I don't know, but Prabha Vishnu Swami, he told me that he'd been involved in Malaysia also from exactly when he got involved, I don't know. Maybe it was even before Jayapataka Maharaj became the GBC there. Like I say, exactly the history, I don't know. Would be good to write a book. Janananda Maharaj wrote a book, Srila Prabhupada in Malaysia. That was actually a project that I started. I did some initial research, did a little writing, and then he followed that up and finished it. But it's good to do a history of the important history of Krishna consciousness in Malaysia. Could be started now because quite a few who were there in the early days already passed away. I can think of Vrindavan Chandra, Jagannath Vallabh, and there must be others also from the early days. Hansadutta has passed away. So yeah, Bhakti Braja, what I'm saying, Prabhu Vishnu Swami told me that he had been on the library party in India, traveling around with Prabhu Vishnu Brahmachari and Mahavishnu Brahmachari. In England, they were known as the two Vishnus, the Vishnu brothers, that's right. And they'd come to India and they were traveling, doing libraries, going to libraries, putting Srila Prabhupada's books in the libraries. That program was winding up because the books the program had been piloted by Gargamuni Swami to distribute so many books of Srila Prabhupada which are coming from America. That book stock was finishing. We didn't have we didn't have Bhagavatam printing in sets. We didn't even have the full sets. We didn't have it in India at that time. The program was winding up, and then Prabhu Vishnu Swami approached Srila Prabhupada and asked for blessing, because he'd been to Nepal or heard something about Nepal, and he thought it'd be a good place for spreading Krishna consciousness. And Srila Prabhupada gave him his blessing. Much more could be said about this. The history of ISKCON in Nepal should also be written. But at that time, Srila Prabhupada gave him Prabhu Vishnu Swami, the garland. He was brahmachari at the time, the garland that he was wearing as a blessing. And then he and with Mahavishnu Swami, now, of course, went there. And then later, Prabhu Vishnu wanted to go to Bangladesh for preaching. And there's some famous incident, but again, I won't get into it too much. The preaching with the heart of a Bengali mother and the courage of an Englishman and the heart of a Bengali mother. And at that time, Srila Prabhupada again gave the garland of blessing. Now, after Srila Prabhupada had passed away, Prabhu Vishnu and Rajendra Kumar, who of course knew each other very well from London, they were discussing about the possibilities of starting some preaching in Malaysia. And they were doing it in Vrindavan. They were sitting just outside Srila Prabhupada's Samadhi, which at that time was just a small brick structure. It wasn't developed at all. But the worship was going on. They were discussing it, and they decided we should do this, and they were thinking we should pray Prabhupada Samadhi for blessings. So they went, and the pujari, when he saw them coming, came out and took the garland from Prabhupada. There was just a picture at that time, and put it on Prabhu Vishnu Swami. So then this way, he took it as an indication that, obviously, that Srila Prabhupada wanted him to go there. So when I went to Malaysia, I'd been in, I believe I was in Bangkok, I think, at the time. I can't remember, because sometimes I served in Bangkok, sometimes in Bangladesh. I was between those two places. And then in between, I'd go to Burma and sometimes to Nepal and Patna, in serving under Prabhu Vishnu Swami in his zone. So they'd got a house in KL, Kuala Lumpur, the capital, and it was just at the border of PJ, Petaling Jaya. It's got a house there which still serves as the temple in Kuala Lumpur, even after all these years, as far as I know. And I'll just say some of the names of the devotees who I remember from that time, because gradually devotees started to join, local young men mostly. And at some point, our godbrother, Prabhupada disciple from Mauritius, Bala, he was there. But one of the very first to join, maybe the first to join, Nitya Krishna, I think his name was, or Nitya Siddha Hansadutta disciple, was also staying with us for some time. And then later, I believe he went to America. So one of the first to join was a devotee who was later initiated as Simheshvara, very capable, and he's more or less very soon moved into a management role and has been in that role ever since. And his young brother, Sri Ganesh, I remember his name from before, Sri Ganesh, who was initiated as Sri Gauranga. Lokesh, I think his name was initiated as Loka Swami. And there was Sevananda, Deva, still active as a preacher, Siddhi Sadhana. Then a little later, Kalesh from Penang. He wasn't in the temple with us in KL. I'm saying that these were the names I said up to now were with us as brahmacharis in that KL temple, the Jagannath Mandir. So Kalesh, a Chinese devotee, joined in Penang, and then there was Radha Krishna was a disciple of Prabhavishnu Swami, mostly all disciples of they're the disciples of Jayapataka Maharaj. He came a little later. Krishna Vahana, disciple of Jayapataka Maharaj from South America, he was there at some point. And others I'll speak of later. My first disciple, I was written, accepted that I can accept disciples, but I wasn't thinking of doing so until a young man called Lakshman, he pushed me into it, so to speak, and he was my first disciple. He was from Malaysia, and more of those early devotees I'll mention later. Also living in the temple with us was Danishta Mataji and Rasaraj, who later married Bhaktin Lajja, who became initiated as Lajjavati. So there must be more, but some more I'll mention later, and no doubt I forgot some of the names. Overall, I found that to be very happy days. In some ways, it was a relief from the austerities I'd been through for some years in serving in austere conditions in various ways in Thailand, well, Bangladesh especially, and then Thailand. Malaysia was a modern country. It was quite rich and developed, which Bangladesh certainly wasn't at the time. It's rich, I believe, from oil. They've got some oil and not a very big population. So quite well-to-do, and modern amenities. It can be a bit of a relief after not having them, or having them in a very rudimentary form for a long time. Although in Thailand we had that to some extent, although we were living in a bit of a dump in Bangkok. But Bangkok, very, very crowded and polluted city, and Malaysia, not like, maybe it is now Kuala Lumpur is more crowded now, but the whole mood is very relaxed kind of people, Malaysians, where the majority population is Malay, and then there's a large Chinese population and a sizable Indian population, and they're pretty relaxed, nice, very nice people. It's modern, Asian culture, and respectful to monks. I also find that I like the climate because it's quite warm all the year round, equatorial climate. And that suited me. So overall, it was happy days. What my memories, I was there from sometime probably before 1985 on and off till I think the last time I visited there was 89, except just a few years ago I was in Singapore and I went in the afternoon to Johor Bahru, which is just over the border, gave a program there and came back the next morning. But apart from that, I haven't been in Malaysia since 1989. So I'd said they were very happy days, and definitely they were. And it wasn't just the relief from the austerities, but one major reason was it was a very nice preaching field, a very, very potent preaching field, which has been developed tremendously since that time. People are very nice, and especially among the Indians, very receptive. Very good association I was getting. Sometimes Prabhu Swami and came in, and Jayam Maharaj came in like a whirlwind from time to time. And nice boys joining, very nice boys joining. I mentioned some of their names, very young, bright in their they're happy boys joining us. Some of them have gone on to be very successful materially now. But one major thing for me in terms of association was I was very happy to get the prolonged association in Kuala Lumpur, staying in the temple with Janananda Prabhu, who I'd known practically from the day I joined. Just maybe after 3 or 4 days after I joined, I first sat down and spent time with him. And I joined in 1975 in Bhaktivedanta Manor near London, and he was there. And even though he was senior to me, he joined 3 or 4 years before. He took me as a friend practically from the beginning. He's like that. He doesn't show I'm big, I'm senior, any such thing. And we renewed our friendship. We hadn't seen each other much in the intervening years. So we were both together in the temple in Kuala Lumpur. We were both the senior men there. And I don't remember who was the temple president, whether it was me or him. Probably officially it was Bhakti Brajendranandan Swami, because he was a local man and accepted by the congregation. As in age he was senior to us, as a sannyasi he was senior to us, but he was out in the preaching field, traveling all over Malaysia mostly. So we two were there. And who was in charge? Actually, there wasn't really either of us in charge. We were both in charge, but it didn't really matter. We worked together so well. He was seeing a lot of the administration, especially seeing the accounts were in order and legal matters, and very much into getting books printed and seeing the book stock, all these things. And I was more into the outgoing preaching and not that he wasn't into the preaching, or that I was not involved in administration, but it didn't matter. We just worked together. It didn't matter to us who who gave the class, who led the kirtan, who offered the arati, who cooked the offering. I mean, between us, if we just do the needful, that's all. In Prabhupada's service. There was no egoism. I have to give the class today. No. Someone else should give the class. It was all cool when so that was, I felt myself very blessed to get his association. I would go out quite often on traveling Sankirtan or preaching programs. Often went to Port Klang, just down the road. So many things. I can't remember them all. So many things, of course. He was going through a bit of a troubled time in devotional service. Himself at the time, there was there's quite a lot of pressure on him, on both of us, but on him especially, because we were real old school brahmacharis, and we'd give classes and we'd say things which members of the congregation especially didn't like. The brahmacharis liked it. The new men, they really got into it, because we'd use words like demons in our talks, and when we're talking with preaching with others, we'd say things like sense gratification is like stool, and just, the kind of normal things that Hare Krishna devotees say. But some of the congregation members took exception to that. And for both of us, it was something which we couldn't really relate to, how people could be very good devotees, very nice people, very cooperative in so many ways, but quite clearly also interested in having a good career and a good car and being known as prestigious, well placed in society. We couldn't relate to it much, but particularly the pressure came on Janananda from the they'd really complain about him to Prabhu Vishnu Swami and Jai Bhattacharya Maharaj. I remember one time Janananda, he came to me, couldn't believe, said they're complaining to me because I use the word karmi. It's just a word we use all the time. Couldn't relate to it. I also saw getting a clobbering, but mostly I got it from Bhakti Brajendra Nandan Swami, who some of the members of the congregation would complain to him, and I would get it from him. He would not get on case of Janananda. It's hard for me not to say Janananda Maharaj as he is now. He wouldn't get on the case of Janananda Prabhu at that time, because they're old friends from the very beginning of the Krishna consciousness days. But he got on my case. He was very heavy. He was very, very heavy. But anyway, and eventually Maharaj's attitude toward me changed, and maybe, I don't know, maybe I softened up a bit or not. I'm not sure. These are just some memories of the kind of things that go on in the Hare Krishna movement when we're all trying to serve Srila Prabhupada together, and there may be misunderstandings, different approaches, different so like that. There's just some of the things that were going on. My happiness in Malaysia, especially, I remember, I very much like to go on book distribution there. The evening times especially, I liked it very much. The only thing was that you usually came back late to the temple, or got back late if you're on traveling Sankirtan. It was very nice, because the daytime is quite hot in Malaysia, but in the evening it's pleasantly warm. And people like to come to outdoor restaurants and take their evening meal. They're relaxed. It's after a day's work. Mostly I'd like to go to the Chinese people, and I don't remember any of the owners ever no, actually sometimes the owners of restaurants would protest about our coming. But if we rotated, we didn't go to the same restaurants all the time, then they wouldn't mind. We'd go to the restaurant and show the books to the this was mostly the way we did book distribution. There was no hard sell. You show the books, and tell them we're monks and ask them to take the book and give a donation. And in Chinese culture, they give donations to monks. And in Indian culture, they give donations to monks. And we didn't approach the Malays at all, because one thing was they weren't so visible in the big cities at that time. Another reason, the government had no problem with us being there as foreigners and preachers, as long as we didn't approach the Malays, who are Muslims. So we followed that, and we didn't have any problems. The Chinese by background, yeah, it's all mixed up. Buddhist, a lot of, but you'd see in many places it was written, they'd have the picture of the, what's the name? Avalokiteshvara, something like this. And the Buddha, and written Om, Chinese, sometimes written in English also, Om Mani Padme Hum, their mantra. So they're Buddhist, but Chinese mixed up with ancestor worship. And there was some Christian, also some Christians who were Chinese, and Chinese Christians, and Indians who become Christian. But they mostly also, many of them took books. And so mostly we just show the books and ask for a donation. And especially I remember we were distributing books in English, Chinese, and Tamil mostly. And mostly we distributed Chinese books. And the most popular was The Light of the Bhagavat, and mostly people, which was quite a big book, a hard book, and people would give usually 20 ringgit for that, which was, nowadays I don't know the value of the money, but that was quite a good donation. And this way we also raised money for the temple. So it was very nice going out in the evening. It's pleasant climate and pleasant people. They're in a pleasant mood. Although if they'd really got into their meal and they're in the middle of it, I won't discuss the kind of things they were eating. I mean, it was not pleasant for the nose or the eyes, the things they were eating. But if they're really in their meal, but if they're just waiting for it to be served or just starting and joking with their friends, it's a great time to give them books. And they take. So I very much like doing that book distribution. Sometimes go out traveling Sankirtan. I remember one particular trip. Yeah, I traveled all over Malaysia on traveling Sankirtan, going to programs with devotees, small programs. That's one thing. After being in Bangladesh with thousands of people, and then in Thailand, we were hardly doing public programs at the time. In the park, we'd go, Lumbini Park. But that wasn't really a program. But it seemed a bit strange to me, being used to so many people in Bangladesh, and you go to a program and there are 15 people, and that's the program. But doing book distribution, traveling, went pretty much all over West Malaysia, and especially on the western side of West Malaysia. It's a peninsula, and most of the population's on the western side. So up and down that, in doing book distribution, traveling, we had a van. One particular trip I remember was very memorable. It was just before Janmashtami, which year I don't remember. It was myself and Prabhavishnu Swami and Bhakta Barry Jenians, who later was initiated in his native New Zealand by Mahavishnu Goswami as Balaram Das. So Barry would do the driving and the shopping and maybe some cooking also. I'm sorry, Barry, Balaram, if you happen to sing this. I can't remember whether cooking or taking raw food or whatever. But he would do all the stuff, and myself and Prabhavishnu Swami were free to do book distribution, and it was great. We loved it. It was great for both of us. It was just a break from management. No management. Just distributing Prabhupada's books all day, every day. It was a marathon for about 10 days or something before Janmashtami, and we went up to the Trengganu, the northeast, and went up to that area. one point I remember what we would do, we'd go into small places, small towns, and often there'd be just like 10 shops or something. And then I'd take one side, he'd take the other, and we'd meet in the middle. So I remember I saw something on his side, which looked like a really good shop. It's an Indian shop, and it's a video shop, and it's usually pretty good. So I broke the rule, and I went in on his side while he was at the far end. I went into that shop, or maybe I think I broke the rule. I went in, and I got, even the people weren't particularly interested in the books or anything, but they gave me 600 ringgit, which was the biggest donation I think I ever got anywhere in the world. And I gave them as many books as I could. And then he was a bit miffed at that, because we're having a competition, who can do the most. And he was every day a little bit ahead of me. But then on the last day was Janmashtami. And then he went back either the night before or Janmashtami, wanted to be there in Kuala Lumpur to be there in Kuala Lumpur all day for the Janmashtami celebration. And I said, no, I'll stay out. I'll do another day. And Barry agreed, and we'll go back at night. And so I had an extra day to try to catch up with him, but it was a tall order to see. It was going to be difficult to catch up with him. That was one of the most blissful Janmashtamis I ever spent. I was all day distributing Srila Prabhupada's books. He was in some mining settlement somewhere. It had been mining. I think there wasn't mining going on there. Chinese, all Chinese. Mostly with the Chinese, couldn't, especially when you're outside the big metropolises, they only spoke Chinese. Maybe they spoke Malay also, but I didn't speak Malay. So I just give them he had a mantra sheet, something written in Chinese saying, I don't know what it said, something like, where monks give a donation. And it was huge. It was a small place, but it took me pretty much all day to do it. And everyone was giving a good donation. There probably no one had ever, anyone like us had ever been there before. And I did a lot of books, and I collected a lot of Lakshmi, and I just got ahead of Vishnu Swami overall. And then I remember, we drove back. It was about, must have been quite late, and took, as far as I remember, it was about 2 hours to get back to the terminus. We came in, there was evening arti or night arti was going on, and I remember Prabhu Vishnu leading the kirtan with his typical style, playing the mridanga with his leg. One leg comes up behind, then the other leg comes up, and he was singing that from Kunti's prayers. What is that? Devaki Nandanaya cha Nanda Gopa Kumaraya Govindaya Namo Namaha. And somehow or other, I forget the first line, but he was singing that at the time. It was very, very blissful. And then after the kirtan, he said, congratulations on winning the marathon. He said, how do you know? I think Barry must have phoned him. Another Sankirtan incident in some town, I can't remember which town, somewhere in West Malaysia, on the western side of West Malaysia. We would take a block of shops, and we'd go around and we'd share them out between us. So Janananda was with us that time. And I went round a block. I didn't do very well. And then a little later, I met Janananda. I said, hey, what are you doing? You're in my block. I said, oh, you're in my block? I'm in your block? Oh, sorry, I didn't realize. It's really good, isn't it? I hadn't been doing well at all. He'd been going around the same block just a few minutes after me out of confusion over which block we're supposed to be doing. And he'd been doing very well, and I hardly did anything at all. Just see, his purity. Then, what else? Just a few notes I made of things I can remember of those times. Some early devotees. Vrindavan Chandra was with us pretty much all the time. He was living at home with his wife, Nandini, and their 2 daughters, but he was with us full time in the temple. He'd drive in every morning. Ravi, airline pilot, and his wife for Malaysian Airlines, and his wife, who had been an air hostess. They became Ravi Lochan and Leela Madhavi. These are some of the early devotees. Rasaraj, I mentioned. Rasaraj and Lajavati. They were in the kitchen in the temple, and I myself and Janananda, we'd often cook. Both of us would cook also, and it was very pleasant to take prasad. That was our main meal. We'd take in the morning. We'd sit just outside. At that time, it was not too hot outside, and we would we'd take prasadam, and a very, very nice mood. So Rasaraj was often cooking. I would sometimes, Janananda would cook. Different offerings were going on apart from the cooking for all the devotees. Some other devotees I remember, Radharaj, I think his name was, and his wife Sudevi, Dayal Gauranga. I think it was Dayal Gauranga or Dayal Govinda. So for quite some time, we had a book distribution party in Penang, staying in an apartment rented by Dhruvanath, which I found. I got the apartment, and then he was staying there with his wife, who was from Colombia, and their son. Dhruvanath Prabhu passed away quite a few years ago. He's also from London, and he was very generous in that we invaded his family for quite a few weeks, and because Penang is the second biggest city in West Malaysia, at least, and we would do that whole area. And Butterworth, Jagannath Vallabh was in Butterworth. Butterworth, just over the Strait of Penang. In those days, there was no bridge. You'd have to take the ferry to come over. So we worked that whole area for quite a few weeks. Back to Kuala Lumpur, the new men were there. I used to give them a verbal bashing regularly and get on their case for all the things that they were doing wrong. And Janananda, he was much softer than myself in dealing with them, so it was something like a strict father and kind mother kind of approach. And they appreciated. Quite a few years later, after many years, I met some of them in Mayapur, and they were so grateful and appreciative that I'd bash them, somewhat into shape. Someone should bash me into shape, I guess. One thing I remember is kirtans. With Janananda around, definitely we're going to have blissful kirtans. In those days, I used to lead a lot of kirtans also. My voice wasn't gone, which it was for many years. I didn't lead kirtans for many years. I still don't much. But I used to lead kirtan. One time, I remember we had a Rath Yatra in Kuala Lumpur. It was just not a very big Rath Yatra, not in the center of the town. It was around the area we were staying in. And it went on for not very long, 2 or 3 hours, something like that. I remember I started the kirtan with the idea, I'll start and then someone else will take over. But I really got into it, and I just led the kirtan all the way through. I just felt so blissful, I didn't stop. I should have given it to someone else, but I didn't. That's one memory. Kirtans in the evening, it gets dark quite early there. By the way, the government made the time zone there. So I was saying it's a bit. The climate's nice. It's quite hot in the day and quite cool in the evening and the night, but not so cool. And it's still quite hot. It's a very humid climate, So we'd do kirtan in the arati, and it was hot and sweaty, and we'd have the doors of the front doors open to let some air in, apart from the fans on, and sometime, I believe it was myself, sometime after, because we'd often like to, after the kirtan in the evening, if we weren't going out for book distribution or doing just some program, we'd do prolonged kirtans. So at some point I believe it was myself, give all the credit to myself as usual, I went out onto the grass, and there's a small lawn in front of the temple, and we were doing kirtan out there. So it was a little cool relief. And then at some point, Singheshwara got the idea to bring out the garden hose and hose us down while we were doing kirtan. And it was okay, because we had these Balaram Mridangas, which were plastic. So we were all getting cooled off, and we were already wet from sweat, and our clothes were sticking, and we became completely wet, and we were all laughing and falling over. And we did that a few times, and I think Janananda stopped it and said, hey, this is getting a bit too much. More laughing anecdote. It's nothing really to do with preaching in Malaysia, but it's just something I remember from the time in Kuala Lumpur. One time, Sarvaksha, who was from New Zealand, but he'd been serving in Bangladesh for some time. He was quite a character. So for some reason or other, he and I believe Rasik was also there for some. Oh, he must have been selling paintings for raising money for Bangladesh. That's what he must have been doing in Malaysia. So he was there, and he had this thing. He liked to needle other devotees with these, speak in such a way that just really, just in a, not in an angry tone, but just in a calm tone, say all kinds of horrendous things about you, to you. He had a habit of doing this. So one morning he was doing this, and I was kind of used to it from Bangladesh, and going on. Sometimes I'd say something a little bit to parry him, and no one was really noticing. It's just the kind of thing he did. But at some point I got a little frustrated. We were in the Brahmachari ashram, and the door of the bathroom was open. I saw some shaving foam on the shelf there, and just on an impulse, just like anger blazed up in me, and I dashed in the bathroom and took the shaving foam. I sprayed him all over. Sprayed him all over his face and his body. He was laughing and laughing. That was a funny anecdote. Nothing really to do with preaching or Krishna consciousness. So yeah, I guess it's fun, devotees having fun. Something I should mention, and probably there are thousands of things if you do a hypnotic regression. Gaumandal Bhumi used to come regularly from Indonesia. He had taken up the very tough service, his lifetime mission of preaching in Indonesia, where the language is very similar to that. Bahasa Indonesia is very simple, from what I understand, a more sophisticated version of Bahasa Malaysia, which is the language, the national language of Malaysia. So he spoke that very well. He learned it, and he was translating Srila Prabhupada's books, and he was developing preaching and in Indonesia. And he would come quite often. I guess that was a bit of a relief for him to be in a play where he could do his translating Srila Prabhupada's books into Bahasa Indonesia, and he would stay sometime with us, and he'd be an associate. He was married, but he's in association with, just some association. I mean, you don't have much association month after month, year after year, in a somewhat hostile climate. I'm talking about the preaching climate, not the weather. So that was nice. We got his association also, a very learned and sober, absolutely dedicated devotee. So we were fortunate to have his association. And that's all I remember at short notice. I made some notes. So All glories to the devotees in Malaysia. All glories to Srila Prabhupada who brought us all together in service at his lotus feet. Vancha kalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhyacha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Dante nithaya churnakang padayo nipatya kritva chakakushatame tadaham ravimi. Hey sadhava sakala eva vihaya durat. Gauranga Chandra Charane Kurutanuragaha Parivadatu Jano Yata Tata Va Nanu Mokaro Nabayang Vicharayamaha Hari Rasa Madira Madati Mata Bhuvi Vilutama Nartama Nirvishama Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare.